Hello everyone. So, this toy popped up all of a sudden in the rumor mill. So, remember on the news recap where we actually talked about the brand new AirRaiser toy that looked so freaking good, but we weren't really sure if this was deluxe or studio series or some other gimmicky line. Rise of the Beast is doing a million little like micro lines, so we have no idea what it was. And then this happened. This came out. And now we're not sure. So this is apparently the Studio Series version of Rise of the Beast AirRaiser, and it certainly does look a lot more movie-esque. The head is far more detailed and greeble covered. It's a lot more involved. The design overall is a lot more involved. But it does look strangely familiar now, doesn't it? So if we look at the Beast mode, you can kind of see what it is. This is Kingdom AirRaiser. And a really weird take on Kingdom AirRaiser. It's the same transformation, which, by the way, is not a great transformation. But why? Why? What did they do? Why does two very different versions of this toy exist? And how is it possible that the retool, the Studio Series one, is going to be not nearly as good or not nearly as well formed as whatever cheaper line that other AirRaiser comes from? So we're all just trying to figure out what this is and why it exists. And I'll tell you this. So I wanted to do this for a while because this brings up a topic that I've had in mind for a while, and that is the terminology that we use as Transformer fans to designate exactly what is going on when a toy gets reused in one way or another. So we get this wrong a lot. So we're going to do a little bit of defining, and then we're going to talk about exactly what this is because we've never really had a good term for it. So welcome to Semantics, the video, where I'm going to nitpick how we use terminology because, hey, grammar is cool if you know how to use it. So first off, let's talk about something like this. All right, so movie Bumblebee, right? So this has been repainted a million times over, right? Wrong. So when we talk about terms, repaint is probably the most common one we use, and it's the one we use the most incorrectly often. So we're talking about repainting, right? So we're talking about a color change, but not all the color, obviously, most of the color doesn't come from paint. It comes from injected plastic color, meaning that when we call something a repaint, we're usually wrong. In fact, in general Transformers, the act of repainting is actually very, very rare. When a toy is molded in all of the same colors, and the only thing changed is the paint and deco or stickers that are applied to it. So for instance, this Bumblebee has been redecoed many, many times, but repainted only a few, like the All-Spark Power version, which basically just adds some blue paint to the already existing toy, just for the sake of re-releasing it. Now, if we want some older examples, we've had one ever since the inception of Transformers. Here's Laserbeak as we normally know him, and then we flip over to his friend Buzzsaw, where the only change is that little bit of die-cast that forms half of his body being repainted into red or gold depending on which version of the toy it is, with some stickering differences as well. So that's what a proper repaint is. Now, you wouldn't think you could do a whole lot with that, but let's take a look at this one. This is OTFCC Roulette, the temporary replacement for BotCon. As you can see, it is a RID sideburn retool with a brand new head. However, if we look at the sister figure that came in the same multi-pack, the only thing different between these two is paint application. All the car parts are entirely painted either black or silver depending on who it is. Shadow Striker here got more paint on the chest, and then Roulette over here got to be a little bit more barren. But it's still, the molding is all in translucent, clear, gold, and black. And that's all the paint that the toy has. Everything else is completely redone. The head, I admit, might be differently molded between the two because that's probably a separate mold. But I genuinely don't know. I'm basing this off of TF Wiki because it's been a long time since I had these two in hand, so I can't say for certain, but for the most part, this is the most extreme example of how much you can change with just the paint color of things. So it can be really impressive when done, correctly. Now, I'm talking about repainting here. What about redeco? Well, that's the common one. Redecoing is basically just changing the decoration of the toy, which accounts for literally any kind of color variation change. When we change the plastic color, that's what makes it a redeco. So any classic Starscream, provided it's not one of the cone heads with new molding, anytime you change him up, that is a redeco. And that is by far the most common reuse that we have for Transformer molds. So when we're talking about like full color changes, we mean redecos, not repaints. That's the semantic part of this, so I apologize because you're still going to use whatever terminology you want. There's nothing wrong with that. Everyone gets the same way. Everyone has this different terms. They've always been using, and they're not going to change it. I get that. This is just me poking at terminology and the English language a little bit. So we can do further here. So we can talk about retools as well, which used to be a pretty rare thing for Transformers. Hasbro just preferred to repaint things all the time. But then they got so much more mileage out of toys that had molding differences. Even usually like that used to amount to just an alternate head. Just a quick represent a different character or a different version of the same character. So so we have our newest Prowl toy in his Earth Deco, and when we switch him up to Smokescreen, you can see it's not just a head remold. We also have the chest and various other little parts retooled in order to capture the look of that toy. Because yes, there is actually difference between the two. The Prowl and Bluestreak are the same mold, aside from a light bar, and then Smokescreen actually has a different front end and a few other little bits. So this is what a proper retooling is. The retooling game has completely changed over the years, however. Like I said, it used to be just swap out a head and call it a different character. It's how BotCon created most of their figures. Hasbro started doing that themselves for mainline toys, but then, however they done, whether it's how they've worked in the mold or how the budgets work out, they've gotten an increased amount of budget for brand new parts in order to make older toys feel new again. And they've done it to pretty impressive degrees a lot of the time. So when we look at something like, Titans Return Blur, I mean, Blur is one of those like super unique vehicles, so where you honestly like look at that and go, who are you ever going to repaint or retool that into? It doesn't look like it could be anybody else. The vehicle is so signature of Blur. What else do you do? Well, you completely redo most of the molding and you turn him from a hover car into a jet. So we got a brainstorm out of Blur, which I never would have expected, but it absolutely works. And yeah, it works really well as a modern, up-to-date version of Brainstorm without having to create a brand new mold to do it. This is the kind of level of retooling that we are now getting into, where some of this stuff is absolutely ingenious with how they're able to reuse a mold in order to create a brand new character. Super impressive to me, given like how far they've come in how they can reuse the figures and get a lot more mileage out of their molds. And it's, of course, great for us as fans because, repaints tend to be a little bit boring, maybe not fit the character so much. So when they can go all out and they can change the tooling to this regard, this makes it so much more interesting. And I'm fascinated by the engineering process behind figuring out how you turn a space, and how you turn a hover car into a spaceship. But it can be done. Clearly, it can be done. Now, retooling these days is a very different beast because now we have completely different ideas behind it. So, let's take a look at Siege Optimus Prime really quickly here. And of course, this was the start of basically a whole new generation of Transformers. We got into proper trilogies again with all matching aesthetic. They focused on robot mode, aesthetic, and like really pushing things like cartoon accuracy and robot mode scale between characters. kind of started with Siege, and we're still going through that now with Legacy. And everything's just been kind of on the same engineering level and expectation ever since we got into this generation here. So, okay, the toy is fine. However, we ended up seeing this toy remolded somewhat. Some of the parts were reused for the Earthrise version of Optimus Prime. The torso is completely new, but the front of the head is the same, and the legs are the same, but they've retooled the legs a little bit to not be as functional, which is also really weird. And here's the weirdest part. The laser Optimus Prime we got now for Legacy this year also shares some parts with the original Siege Optimus. Now, they've been retooled, so technically they're not new, but there are residual components that are still left behind in this figure. 3 years later, we are still seeing this toy reused somewhat, and that's more and more common, where sometimes a toy is completely different, but the thighs aren't worth creating. It's not worth creating brand new thighs, or it's not worth creating brand new internal structures, or, you know, biceps, or like those little parts that on a lot of Transformers tend to look pretty generic, smooth, no real reason to change them between one character or another. So we can look at another example where we have Moonracer here. Now, Power of the Prime figure, so she does have a combiner block in her. This is a horribly infamous mold for how many times they retooled it in order to create the Elita 1 combiner, whichever name for her you want to go by, Elita Infinite or Orpheus, I want to say, like Orpheus. Someone's going to correct me in the comments because I even tried. Okay, so I apologize for even trying. I can't remember what they called her. But the point is that this toy eventually somehow ends up being this Chromia. The transformation structure is entirely the same, except we can't call it a brand new toy because it is reusing a few parts here and there from the Moonracer mold. Even though it's not a combiner now, there are still residual mold parts. So what do we call that? What do we call that, where it's reusing, 15% of a previous mold, but everything else is brand new, but it's not brand new because it's reusing the engineering scheme? And this is where my brain starts to hurt trying to figure this stuff out. But this brings us all the way back to the two Airazors. So, obviously, the new Airazor that we have seen is not a retool of the previous one. It's larger, it's more buff. All the detailing is completely different. The only thing that is the same between the two is the transformation engineering, because sometimes that is the most expensive part of the figure to actually come up with. You're talking about all these, like, there are dozens of parts, even in just a deluxe. There are dozens upon dozens of parts that all have to be measured out and aligned just correctly. Every angle needs to be right. Every thickness of the plastic needs to be thick enough to hold up. Every tab needs to be lined up in exactly the right spot. Every hinge needs to be so wide, but it can't be too wide. There's so many things that we don't even think about go into the actual engineering part of creating a Transformer that I think we don't really appreciate just how much sometimes. So when we see something like this, it is a fairly inexpensive way of creating something that is technically brand new, but all of the technical stuff has already been accounted for, so it is far easier for Hasbro and Takara to produce. But we've never really had a name for it, now have we? So I kind of played around with a few terms. I tried reincarnation for a little bit because that's, technically, you're bringing the old idea of the toy back to life, but it's a little too wordy. There's too many syllables to that. It needs to be punchy, repaint, retool, things like that. So what I've landed on is something of a more modern phrase, reskin. It's using the same skeleton of the figure, in this case the engineering, but everything on it is looking completely fresh and new. So, yeah, it's a reskin. It's the original toy, but they changed everything about the visuals. That seemed to make sense to me. And it's not the first time we've seen that. I think the one people got a hold of the most is Generation 2 Smokescreen. And yes, there are two smokescreens in this video. They have nothing to do with each other. Hey, name dumping in the 90s was fun. But however, This design ended up eventually becoming Energon Starscream. Exact same transformation, and for years, like literally for years, even though these two had completely different styles, even though these two had very different sizes to them, for years, people kept saying that this was a retool of the G2 smokescreen mold, and that it was never, ever true. It's reusing the design scheme. It's reusing the transformation. It's a reskin of the original figure without actually being the original figure. You know, and that was just a case of a Takara designer was super proud of how that toy came out. So it was so basically that that engineering style was redone when it felt appropriate, and that's where it felt appropriate apparently. So we've had this in the past, but it is a very rare thing to happen. But I wouldn't be surprised if, as a cost-cutting tool, we didn't see more of it down the line. But like I said, I don't really mind that because sometimes transformation schemes can be really fun, and I don't mind owning a toy that lets me fiddle with it again, especially if like the new sculpt and the new figure suits it better, which I think in the case of this Starscream, it's more solid and more fun of a toy than the original smokescreen was. So there is a merit to it. But while we are at it, this is again a term that would get muddy. I call this a reskin, but then we have things like Silverbolt here, who was heavily retooled into Cyclonus and Scattershot, but it does retain parts from the originals. So again, I can't exactly call it, I can't call it a reskin. But then we get to things like Hunger, who does use much of the same engineering because it is, loosely tied to the original designer who did Silverbolt. However, it has a bunch of its own engineering and tooling as well. But especially for the torso transformation, it does reuse a lot from Silverbolt. So it's a reskin that also retools a lot of parts. And this is where things get really complicated again, and now I'm out of ideas for terminology. If you have any idea what we call something that's done like this, please let me know, because this is actually getting more and more common amongst Transformers as they look for ways of reusing molds more and more creatively. But that is what we have for now. So that's the fandom's terminology that we've come to know over the years. Some of it we are using wrong, and some of it we need to come up with new words. But I think it's fascinating that we just kind of latched onto these things. I don't think Hasbro or Takara ever told us what they called it specifically. We just kind of took it upon ourselves in the fandom one day. If it came from an official source, it's not one I'm aware of. But that is what I have for you today. Just a weird little linguistic lesson in Transformers. So thank you for watching a video that may be entirely pointless, but I know AirRazor made me think of it today, so I kind of wanted to go over it. But thank you guys for watching, and as always, I will see you next time. Guys, I am facing the most powerful enemy any YouTuber can face, the algorithm, and I need your help to defeat him. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment. Every time you do, we attack that algorithm and we drive it back until it can no longer defeat this channel. Thank you very much.